Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Mercenary Kings. This is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up by Tribute Games that was released for PC, Mac, Linux, PS4, and a PS Vita version is in the works. It's kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. It was kickstarted, and it was done by most of the same people who worked on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game, which I have not played. I've heard it's amazing, but I haven't played it myself, and frankly I don't really have all that much desire to play it, because I don't really have all that much interest in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I'd feel like I would need to read the comics or watch the movie or something like that in order to actually be able to really get anything out of that game. And even then, it's not available on XBLA or PSN anymore, so you can't get it anymore. You can, however, get this, which went into early access in 2013 and finally came out of early access in March of 2014. And it's definitely got a couple of interesting things going for it in the gameplay department. But first, let's talk about the presentation, which is pretty fantastic for the most part. The pixel art is all done by Paul Robertson, and if you've seen his work before, you will immediately recognize it. He is a fantastic pixel artist. The stuff he does is very highly stylized, very colorful, and this is no exception. It's very bright, it's very colorful, it's very cartoony, and it really does elicit this sort of classic, over-the-top run-and-gun, side-scrolling shoot-'em-up kind of thing really well. That said, it does wear on you after a while because, well, there's a ridiculous amount of asset reuse. Now, it makes sense for enemies and such like that, but there's only a handful of tile sets in this thing, and they are constantly reused, and basically just randomized. Now, I'll get to that more when I get to the gameplay portion of this, but suffice to say, despite the art style being excellent and it giving the game a lot of charm, it is a double-edged sword because it quite simply overstays its welcome. The game is about 100 missions, all of which use the same handful of tile sets. It just gets tiring eventually. Same thing goes for the sound design. It's pretty well done for what it is. I mean, it's got some pretty catchy chiptunes. It's got some sound effects that feel right at home with what they're trying to go for. The voice acting, what little there is anyway, is certainly kind of goofy and fits in with the game quite well. It's just that, once again, over the course of 100 missions, it gets really tiring really quickly. And that's really the main problem that the game has, especially when I get to this gameplay portion. It's a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up in kind of the Metal Slug vein, although they do also mention Gunstar Heroes as one of their big inspirations for it. But suffice to say, you're running around, jumping on platforms, sliding down zip lines, blasting the living crap out of every enemy that comes anywhere near you. There are a variety of enemies that you blast. Some of them just do simple one-shots at you. Some of them run up and try to stab you or do other kinds of melee attacks. Some of them jump around. Some of them fly. There's, of course, boss fights in the game, where you take on big boss enemies that have very specific attack patterns that you have to memorize and exploit. And it all feels very familiar if you've played any of those old classic arcade shoot-'em-up sorts of games. And all of that stuff, the very basic mechanics, works out pretty well for the most part. The controls are pretty responsive, the actual gun mechanics feel perfectly fine for what they are, and generally speaking that gives you a sort of nostalgic vibe. Where things sort of get turned on their head is in the hub, where you go back to base camp and you can buy upgrades, you can upgrade your armor, upgrade your weapons, customize your weapons by attaching different things. You can have different receivers that will fire different projectiles, different barrels that will affect the accuracy, the damage, all these different stats that you can mess with in order to create some fairly unique weapons and thus eviscerate your foes. There's only one really nasty problem with that. It's a crafting system that is based off of resources that you get by grinding. I've said this before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, but I absolutely hate grinding in video games. It is one of the single most boring time wasters you can possibly throw into something, and I hate it. And unfortunately, that's all this game is. There are only a handful of missions in this game that actually have anything resembling a story in them. And they're basically the last missions that you get in a given series of missions. These series of missions are based on your rank, and you have to basically go through the entirety of a given segment's missions in order to unlock the final mission, and then thus go on to the next set of missions, which is going to be more of the same damn thing, maybe on a slightly different tile set, and it's just going to repeat ad nauseum. It took me all of 30 minutes to get bored with the thing, although I tried to persevere through it for about 2 hours in total. Yes, I did in fact play it co-op. That is one of the options in the game, and that is in fact the way they intended it to be played, basically. Only one problem with that. The co-op doesn't exactly work as well as it should. We did have some connection issues when me and my friends tried to play it, and when we did play it, it was just us running around the level and blasting enemies in order to basically farm materials, and it wasn't exactly the most compelling gameplay experience. In fact, there were frequent moments where we just got completely lost as to what we were trying to do. And that was because the game does an absolutely terrible job of directing you around levels. You see, the levels are basically randomly generated. Now, they're going to be the same every single time you go into them, but they're basically randomly generated, and they never really figured out pathing all that well. They just made them a bunch of arenas that just kind of go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And what's worse about that is that because there's not really any significant pathing, you're not going in one specific direction like in, say, Metal Slug, it gets actually rather confusing to figure out exactly what you missed, where you missed it. The game is not complicated. It's basically go to this specific location, either eviscerate all your foes or just talk to an NPC or any number of things like that. Some of the missions are quite simply gather materials, so just grinding in mission form, which is just annoying as hell. And gradually you just lose interest. And in the case of those particularly badly designed levels, you just end up wandering around them for what feels like forever until you finally either run out the timer or you figure out exactly what you're supposed to do. You just get lucky most of the time and just stumble upon it somehow. Or you have to consult the map and then call in the transceiver to say, oh, well, here's where the boss is right now. Okay, now let me go find them and deal with them, and now I've won the mission. Woo! And that all just gets incredibly tedious incredibly quickly. The game starts out pretty interesting, and it's got these interesting ideas, what with the crafting and the co-op and such like that, but ultimately it just ends up devolving into 100 missions of the same damn thing over and over and over again until you just give up on the game entirely. So all that great artwork and that good sound design just goes to waste on a game that is mechanically sound but is just not well designed. Doing what are basically randomly generated levels in a game like this is a very bad idea because it loses its steam incredibly quickly. A game like Metal Slug works because it's fast-paced, it's linear, it's a very simple state of, oh, I know exactly what I have to do at every given moment. It's fast, it's exciting, it's tense. This, on the other hand, is a fairly languorous journey where you just run around the level until you figure out what the hell you're actually trying to kill or gather or whatever it might well be. In a lot of cases in the gathering stuff, you just straight up have to farm things over and over again until they drop exactly what you want them to drop, and that is just tedium in and of itself. And the only real interesting things it does are the crafting system, which unfortunately is also the double-edged sword of being insanely tedious to deal with, and the co-op mode, which is really just putting a band-aid on a tumor. Sure, every game is better with friends, so they say. That's not enough to save this game. And ultimately, I can't bring myself to finish it. I just got too bored. Hence the MTO rather than a full-on review. I simply cannot bring myself to finish the game because it has gotten way too damn boring. Your mileage may vary, however. If you manage to get it on sale for really cheap, maybe you might like it, but frankly, if you're looking for a game like this, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, just play Metal Slug. The developers of those definitely understood what it takes to make an excellent scrolling shooter. The developers of Mercenary Kings had some of it, but they didn't quite get there because of the way they design the levels. And that's really a shame. I'll have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up on Steam if you're interested. Thanks for watching.